They called her the ghost of the wire, the quiet analyst who never ran the morning drills and whose presence was as unobtrusive as the low hum of the servers she tended. Sergeant Major Kendrick, a man forged in the crucible of shouted orders and brute force, called her dead weight, a liability in a place where strength was the only currency he understood. He learned in the ringing silence of a catastrophe that she was not weight at all. She was gravity, a force that bent the world to her will. By the time he truly understood the nature of his mistake, she was already in motion, a blur of calculated precision against a backdrop of ruin, and the base record he cherished, the one etched in steel and sweat, was nothing more than dust under the soles of her boots. But her operating base. Acheron was a wound in the earth. It had been carved out of the unforgiving granite of the Akatorian mountain range, a place where the planet's bones jutted through its thin skin like broken ribs. The air was thin and tasted of metal and cold stone, a permanent razor in the lungs. Silence in the mountains was a physical presence, a pressure on the eardrums that made the sudden shriek of a comms unit or the clang of a dropped tool feel like a violation. Inside the warren of interconnected modules that constituted the base, the silence was replaced by a different kind of pressure. Here, it was the ceaseless, subliminal thrum of the facility's life support, the whisper of ventilation, the deep, resonant drone of the geothermal power core, and the high, almost unheard whine of the data processing centers that were Acheron's entire reason for being. The base was a listening post, a digital ear pressed against the heart of a hostile continent, and its soul was made of servers and fiber optic cable. Corporal Ava Rostova felt the base not as a collection of rooms and corridors, but as a single, complex organism. She perceived its rhythms in the subtle vibrations that traveled through the concrete floor into the soles of her boots, in the minute fluctuations of air pressure, as massive blast doors cycled in the deeper levels. She spent her designated duty hours in the cool, sterile dark of server room Gamma, her fingers flying across holographic interfaces with a fluid economy of motion. But her real work began when she was off the clock. She walked the base, not with the purposeful stride of a soldier, but with the quiet, observational drift of a ghost. She would stand for an hour in a maintenance conduit, her head tilted, listening to the groan of a stressed support beam. She would run her fingertips along the welded seams of the outer hull, her touch as sensitive as a seismograph, feeling for the telltale signs of metal fatigue. She was cataloging its weaknesses, learning its secret architecture, mapping the skeleton that lay beneath the uniform gray skin of its walls. Her appearance was a study in deliberate anonymity. She wore the same standard fatigues as everyone else, but they seemed to hang on her differently, less a uniform than a disguise. Her face, pale and unlined, was a neutral mask, her gray eyes holding a stillness that many found unnerving. They were eyes that didn't just look, they assessed. They measured angles, calculated tensile strengths, and logged stress fractures. She spoke only when a direct question required a factual answer, and her voice was low and even, stripped of any discernible emotion. She was an anomaly, a whisper in a world of shouts, and the other soldiers gave her a wide berth, unsure what to make of the quiet woman who seemed more interested in the facility's plumbing than in its people. They saw an outcast, a strange cog in the rigid military machine. They did not see the coiled potential within her, the perfect lethal harmony of mind and body held in a state of constant, patient readiness. Sergeant Major Kendrick was a man built of noise and mass. He moved through the narrow corridors of FOB Acheron like a weather system, his voice a percussive blast of stale pronouncements and barked orders that echoed long after he had passed. He was a relic of a different kind of army, an institution of polished boots and parade ground drills, and he viewed the sterile, high-tech world of Acheron with a deep and abiding suspicion. He saw the technicians and analysts, with their pale faces and quiet intensity, as a lesser breed of soldier. To Kendrick, strength was measured in decibels, in the sweat of forced marches, and in the unthinking obedience to the hierarchy he sat atop. He was a large man, his uniform straining at the seams, not with muscle, but with the soft, settled weight of a career spent behind a desk. His authority a shield against the creeping obsolescence he felt every time he walked past a server room. His gaze snagged on Corporal Rostova like a nail on silk. He saw her one afternoon, not in the mess hall or the rec room, but perched precariously on a service gantry 60 feet above the main hangar floor, her attention fixed on the junction where a primary support strut met the ceiling. She was motionless, a spider on a web, and the sight filled him with a potent cocktail of irritation and contempt. She was outside his sphere of understanding, and therefore outside his control. She did not participate in the mandatory morning physical training sessions he ran with the zeal of a fanatic. She did not join the grunts in the weight room. Her name was a persistent, unexcused absence on his PT rosters, a small act of defiance that gnawed at his sense of order. He saw her quiet non-compliance not as a function of a different duty, but as an insult to his authority. He decided then and there that she needed to be broken back into the mold, made to understand the simple, brutalist philosophy that had governed his entire life. You were either strong or you were useless. The confrontation came, as he had intended, in the most public of venues, the morning formation on the main parade deck. It was a cavernous space carved from the mountain itself, the raw rock of the ceiling soaring 100 feet overhead. The air was cold, and the assembled soldiers' breath plumed in the harsh glare of the halogen lights. Kendrick stood before them, his hands on his hips, his jaw set in a mask of theatrical belligerence. He had just finished a 20-minute tirade about discipline, his voice bouncing off the rock walls, a hammer blow of rhetoric. His eyes scanned the ranks, and then, with practiced deliberation, they settled on Rostova. "Corporal Rostova," he boomed, the name a weaponized sound. "A pleasure to see you decided to grace us with your presence this morning. Usually at this time, what is it you do? Counting wires? Polishing keyboards?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the formation. Rostova stood perfectly still, her expression unchanging. She did not look at him, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance. She was calculating the acoustic properties of the chamber, noting how his voice was distorted by the uneven surfaces of the rock. "My duties are technical, Sergeant Major," she replied, her voice calm and devoid of inflection. It was a simple statement of fact, but in the charged atmosphere, it sounded like a challenge. Kendrick's face darkened. He thrived on emotional response, on fear and intimidation. Her placid neutrality was a denial of his power. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. He was a wall of khaki and indignation. He gestured with a thick thumb toward the far end of the parade deck, where a monstrous structure of steel, cable, and concrete loomed in the shadows. It was the Gauntlet, Acheron's obstacle course, a brutalist masterpiece of physical punishment designed to break men. Technical duties, he sneered, the words dripping with scorn. Out here, Corporal, we have a different kind of technical challenge. See that? He pointed directly at the course. That is a test of will, of strength, of a soldier's heart, things you wouldn't understand. The record for that course, a record held by a real soldier for 3 years, is 4 minutes and 17 seconds. He paused, letting the weight of his pronouncement settle over the assembled troops. He turned his attention back to Rostova, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, mocking tone, loud enough for everyone to hear. I have a theory, Corporal. I think the reason you skip my PT sessions isn't because of your technical duties. I think it's because you're weak. I think you're a ghost in the machine, all right. A ghost who couldn't climb a 10-foot wall if her life depended on it. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. This was more than a dressing down. It was a ritual humiliation. Every soldier on that deck knew the score. They were witnessing a public execution of a soldier's credibility. Kendrick had laid down the challenge, framing it in the only terms he understood. He expected her to crumble, to stammer an apology, to shrink under the weight of his public disdain. He was establishing the pecking order in the most primitive way possible. Rostova finally moved. She turned her head slowly, and for the first time, her eyes met his. There was no fear in them, no anger. There was only a calm, dispassionate analysis. She glanced past him, her gaze sweeping over the gauntlet. She wasn't seeing an obstacle course. She was seeing a series of interconnected physics problems. She saw the vertical terror wall not as a barrier, but as a simple issue of friction coefficients and body weight distribution. She saw the weaver's loom, a nightmarish cat's cradle of steel bars, as a problem of momentum and angular velocity. She noted the slight sag in the high-tension cable of the Tyrolean traverse, indicating a subtle flaw in its anchoring. She saw the entire course as a flawed system, designed for brute strength, not for efficiency. It was a clumsy, loud, and inefficient piece of engineering, much like the man standing in front of her. Her gaze returned to Kendrick. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. The other soldiers shifted their weight, their eyes darting between the immovable object and the seemingly unstoppable force. Kendrick's smirk began to feel strained, his bluff being called in a language he didn't speak. He needed a reaction, a crack in her composure. Well, Corporal, he pressed, his voice a little too loud. Nothing to say? Cat got your tongue? Rostova's response when it came was not what anyone expected. It was quiet, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the vast chamber with the precision of a scalpel. The course record is 4 minutes, 17 seconds, she stated, not as a question, but as a confirmation of data. She looked at the course again, her eyes narrowing slightly. The design is inefficient. The optimal path, accounting for material stress and energy expenditure, should be under 3 minutes and 45 seconds. She turned her gaze back to him. Your methods are inefficient, Sergeant Major. A collective intake of breath swept through the ranks. It was an act of open heresy. She hadn't just deflected his insult. She had analyzed his sacred cow, found it wanting, and dismissed it with the cold, clinical finality of a scientist discarding a failed hypothesis. Kendrick's face went from a ruddy red to a deep, apoplectic purple. His mouth opened and closed, but for the first time since he had arrived at Acheron, no sound came out. He had expected fear and had been met with physics. He had demanded respect and had been handed a critique. In that moment of stunned silence, The power dynamic in the room fractured, a hairline crack in the foundation of his authority. He had picked a fight with a ghost, and the ghost had refused to play by his rules. The tension hung in the air, a promise of a reckoning yet to come. The crisis did not arrive with the shriek of an incoming missile or the chatter of enemy fire. It came as a deep, resonant groan from the heart of the mountain itself. It was a sound that was felt more than heard, a low-frequency vibration that hummed up through the soles of their boots and into the marrow of their bones. The lights flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the entire base into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The emergency lights, powered by independent batteries, sputtered to life a second later, casting the corridors in the hellish, pulsating red of a dying star. Then the shaking began. It was not a tremor, it was a convulsion. The mountain was a beast trying to shrug off the parasite burrowed into its flesh. Concrete dust rained down from the ceilings, and the air filled with the high-pitched shriek of tortured metal. A deep, tearing sound, like the world ripping in half, echoed from the lower levels. Men who had faced enemy fire without flinching cried out in primal fear as the very ground beneath them became an enemy. The shaking lasted for 47 seconds. To the inhabitants of FOB Acheron, it was an eternity. When it finally subsided, the silence that rushed in to fill the void was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was the silence of a tomb. The damage was catastrophic. The seismic event, a magnitude 7.9 tremor whose epicenter was less than 5 kilometers from the base, had done what no enemy ever could. It had broken Acheron's back. Major structural supports had been sheared clean through. Entire sections of the base were now impassable, crushed into a labyrinth of shattered concrete and twisted rebar. But the most critical damage was in the base's nerve center. The primary and secondary coolant conduits for the geothermal core had been severed. A tertiary emergency system was holding, but it was a stopgap, a finger in a dam that was about to burst. Alarms blared from every functional console, a symphony of disaster. The core temperature was rising. If it reached critical mass, it would not explode in a nuclear sense, but it would flash melt its containment, and the resulting release of superheated steam and radioactive isotopes would turn the entire mountain into a permanent, sterile monument to their failure. They had 90 minutes. Sergeant Major Kendrick, his face pale and beaded with sweat, reacted in the only way he knew how, with volume and brute force. He bellowed orders, his voice cracking with a fear he tried to mask with fury. "Get engineering teams down to Sector Delta. I want that corridor cleared. Use the breaching charges. Move, move, move." The problem was that Sector Delta no longer existed. It was now a solid wall of collapsed rock and duracrete. The manual override for the coolant system, their only hope, was on the other side of that wall. Lieutenant Davies, a young but competent engineer, tried to reason with him. "Sergeant Major, the charges are too risky. The entire structure is unstable. A directed blast could bring the whole sector down on top of us. We need to assess the structural integrity first." "Assess!" Kendrick roared, his face inches from the lieutenant's. "We have 90 minutes until this place cooks us alive, and you want to assess? Get your men and you get that passage open, Lieutenant, or I will have you brought up on charges for gross insubordination. That is a direct order." Davies, his jaw tight, had no choice but to comply. His team, their faces grim, set the charges. Kendrick stood back, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. This was his world. Decisive action, controlled violence, the application of force to solve a problem. The charges detonated with a deafening crack. For a moment, it seemed to have worked. A cloud of dust billowed out. But then a deep groaning sound began, and a spiderweb of cracks spread across the ceiling above them. A massive section of the upper corridor, its support compromised, peeled away and slammed down, sealing the passage even more completely, the impact sending a shockwave that threw them all from their feet. The attempt had been a catastrophic failure. They had not only failed to clear the path, they had made it infinitely worse, and had likely shortened their own timeline as the shock further destabilized the already critical systems. Kendrick stared at the new wall of rubble, his face a mask of disbelief. His methods, the only methods he had ever known, had failed. The world had presented him with a problem that could not be solved by yelling at it or blowing it up, and he was left with nothing. The brute force of his will had shattered against the unyielding physics of the situation. The confident, bellowing leader was gone, replaced by a man staring into the abyss of his own incompetence. Into the stunned, dust-choked silence, a new sound emerged. It was the soft, deliberate crunch of boots on fallen debris. Eva Rostova stepped out of the shadows. She had not been part of the panicked rush or the ill-fated demolition attempt. While Kendrick had been shouting, she had been observing. While his team had been setting charges, she had been mapping the new topology of the disaster, her mind a whirlwind of calculations. The seismic shock had sent terabytes of stress and strain data through the facility's internal sensor network before it failed. She had caught enough of it, a ghost image of the base's new, broken skeleton. She held a datapad in her hand, its screen displaying a three-dimensional wireframe model of the collapsed sector, glowing lines of red and orange indicating points of extreme structural stress. She walked past the dumbstruck Kendrick without a glance, stopping before the wall of fresh rubble. She didn't look at the impassable blockage in front of her. She looked up. "The direct path is compromised," she stated, her voice cutting through the ringing in their ears. It was not an opinion. It was a final, clinical diagnosis. The concussive force of the detonation has fractured the primary load-bearing arch in sub-level 3. Further attempts at this entry point will trigger a cascading structural failure across the entire sector. She turned, her gray eyes sweeping over the assembled soldiers, finally landing on Lieutenant Davies. "There is another way." Kendrick found his voice, a ragged bark of disbelief and wounded pride. "Another way? There is no other way, Corporal. You saw the schematics. That corridor was the only access." Rostova's gaze shifted to him. It was cold, dismissive. "The schematics are no longer relevant. They represent a structure that does not exist anymore." She turned back to Davies, tapping her datapad. The wireframe model shifted, highlighting a new, seemingly impossible route. It went up, through a shattered maintenance shaft, across the exposed and dangerously unstable superstructure of the hangar bay ceiling, through a ventilation duct that was now hanging precariously over a 200-foot drop, and finally down through a damaged service hatch directly above the coolant override console. It was not a path for a team. It was a path for one person with an impossible level of skill and a complete absence of fear. "The route is viable," Rostova said, her tone as matter-of-fact as if she were plotting a course on a map. "The primary I-beams in the hangar ceiling are cantilevered and have held their integrity, but the connecting trusses are under extreme torsional stress. The traverse requires a body weight of no more than 70 kilograms and a dynamic load distribution that avoids resonance frequencies. It must be a continuous, fluid movement, no stopping. The ventilation duct has detached from its northern anchor. It will only support a transverse crawl for approximately 12 meters before shear failure. She looked at the faces staring back at her, blank with incomprehension and fear. They were soldiers, trained for combat on a horizontal plane. She was describing a world of verticality and physics that was utterly alien to them. Kendrick laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That's not a route. That's suicide. You're insane. No one can make that traverse." "I can," Rostova said simply. The words hung in the air, stripped of bravado or ego. It was a statement of capability, delivered with the same certainty as a law of physics. In that moment, the informal hierarchy of Ephab Acheron already cracked, shattered completely. Kendrick's authority, based on rank and volume, had evaporated in the face of a crisis he could not comprehend, let alone solve. Rostova's authority, emerging from the pure, undeniable force of her competence, became the only thing left that mattered. She was the solution. Lieutenant Davies was the first to understand. He had seen the failure of the old way, the sheer, bloody-minded incompetence of Kendrick's approach. He looked at the calm, focused analyst, then at the sputtering, red-faced sergeant major. He saw the path of failure and the path of possibility. The choice was simple. He straightened up, his face set with a new resolve. "What do you need, Corporal?" he asked, his voice clear and steady. The use of her rank was a formality. The tone was one of deference to a new commander. "Lighting," Rostova said, without hesitation, her eyes already tracing the beginning of her route up the shattered wall. "Position portable lamps to illuminate the hangar superstructure. I need to see the micro-fractures in the steel. And I need absolute radio silence, no distractions." "You heard her!" Davies barked at his stunned team, his own voice taking on a new edge of command. "Get the battle lanterns. Move!" Kendrick stepped forward, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "Davies, you will stand down. I am still in command here. This is a direct order. This entire facility will not be jeopardized by the delusions of one data clerk." Davies turned to face him. The young lieutenant, who had always deferred, who had always followed the chain of command, now stood his ground. "With all due respect, Sergeant Major," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "your command just sealed our only access and nearly brought the roof down on our heads. Her delusions are the only chance we have left. My men and I are following the only viable plan. You are welcome to stay here and shout at the rubble." It was the final blow. Kendrick was left standing alone, a king with no subjects, his authority rendered meaningless. He watched, speechless, as the soldiers scrambled to follow Rostova's sparse, precise instructions. The power had not been taken from him. It had simply flowed away, drawn to the true center of gravity in the room. He watched as Rostova stripped off her outer jacket, revealing a lean, wiry frame that seemed to possess no excess mass at all. She moved to the base of the ruined wall, her hands testing holds, her body a study in coiled kinetic potential. He had mocked her for her weakness, for her avoidance of his brutalist training. He was about to learn that strength came in forms he couldn't possibly imagine. The beams of the portable lamps cut through the dust-filled darkness of the hangar bay, painting stark islands of light onto the mangled steel skeleton of the ceiling 200 feet above. The silence was absolute, broken only by the strained groaning of the damaged structure and the distant, insistent scream of the core temperature alarms. Every eye was fixed on the small figure now ascending the sheer, debris-strewn face of the collapsed corridor wall. Rostova moved with an unnerving, fluid grace. It was not the clumsy, muscle-bound climbing of a soldier. It was something else entirely, a vertical dance. Her movements were economical, precise, each handhold and foothold tested and secured before she shifted her weight. She did not use strength to pull herself up. She used momentum and balance, her body a pendulum swinging from one point to the next. She reached the top of the wall, a jagged precipice of broken concrete, and paused for a single, controlled breath. Below her, the hangar floor was a chaotic landscape of wrecked equipment and shattered plating. Before her lay the true test, a chasm of darkness, bridged only by the skeletal remains of the ceiling's support structure. The main I-beam, a river of steel 3 feet wide, stretched out into the gloom. It was slick with condensation and dusted with a fine layer of concrete powder. To the soldiers watching from below, it looked like an impossible tightrope. To Rostova, it was a path. She launched herself from the wall in a low, controlled leap, landing on the beam not with a thud, but with the soft, balanced impact of a cat. She didn't stop. As she had said, stopping was death. Stopping would allow her own weight to build up as a static load, to find the resonant frequency of the damaged beam and amplify the vibrations until it failed. She had to become a part of the system, a transient wave of force passing through it too quickly to do any harm. She ran. Her feet barely seemed to touch the steel, her arms outstretched for balance, her eyes focused on the far side of the bay. The beam vibrated under her feet, a low hum that traveled up her legs, feeding her a constant stream of tactile information about its integrity. Halfway across, she reached the first of the compromised trusses. It was a latticework of smaller beams, twisted and bent by the tremor. There was no way to run across it. She transitioned from a run to a fluid, rolling motion, diving into a shoulder roll that carried her over a jagged tear in the metal, her momentum unabated. She moved through the wreckage not like a person, but like water, flowing through the path of least resistance. She used a bent support strut as a vaulting horse, swinging her body over a gap that would have stopped any other person cold. Every movement was a calculation, a perfect expression of applied physics. The men below could only watch, their breath held tight in their chests. They were witnessing something that defied their understanding of human capability. Kendrick stood among them, his face slack, his worldview being systematically dismantled with every impossible step she took. He had seen men run the gauntlet, all brute force and grunting effort. This was different. This was artistry. This was genius. She reached the far side of the hangar and the next obstacle, the severed ventilation duct. It hung from its remaining anchor like a broken limb, a fragile metal tube suspended over the abyss. As she had predicted, it was a death trap. She didn't hesitate. She dropped to a low crawl, distributing her weight as widely as possible, her movements slow and deliberate. The metal groaned in protest, the sound of tearing bolts echoing in the cavernous space. She moved with the patient, inexorable crawl of a sniper, inch by agonizing inch. The soldiers below could see the duct visibly sagging under her, the remaining anchor bolts straining against the pull of gravity. She was 40 feet out when a bolt gave way with a sharp crack like a rifle shot, and the duct lurched downwards, swinging violently. A collective gasp rose from the watchers, but Rostova had anticipated it. The moment she felt the shift in tension, she was already moving, her body surging forward in a final desperate burst of speed, her fingers hooking over the lip of the maintenance hatch on the far side, just as the last anchor tore free. The massive ventilation duct plunged into the darkness below, crashing to the floor with a deafening final boom. She hung there for a moment, a silhouette against the red emergency lighting of the corridor beyond, before pulling herself up and disappearing inside. A profound, ringing silence descended upon the hangar. The external threat, the impossible traverse, was over. But the internal threat, the rising temperature of the core, remained. The soldiers stared at the empty hatchway where she had vanished, the seconds stretching into an eternity. Davies held his breath, his knuckles white where he gripped his radio. Kendrick stared, his mouth slightly agape, the sheer, arrogant certainty that had defined him utterly stripped away. He had built his world on a foundation of measurable, physical strength, and he had just witnessed a demonstration of a power so far beyond his comprehension that it might as well have been magic. 1 minute passed, then another. The core temperature alarm continued its shrill, monotonous pulse. Doubt began to creep back into the minds of the men on the floor. Maybe she hadn't made it. Maybe the hatch was jammed. Maybe the console was destroyed. The fragile hope that had bloomed in the hangar began to wither. Then it stopped. The alarm cut out mid-shriek, plunging the base into an almost forgotten state of quiet. A moment later, the main power grid surged back to life. The harsh red emergency lights were replaced by the steady, clean white of the main illumination grid. The deep, life-giving hum of the base's systems returned. On a nearby monitor, Davies watched as the temperature readings for the geothermal core began to plummet, falling from the critical red zone back into the stable, reassuring green. The threat was neutralized. The base was saved. A ragged, spontaneous cheer erupted from the soldiers, a raw, primal release of tension and terror. They clapped each other on the back, their faces lit with the giddy relief of survivors. They had been pulled back from the brink of annihilation, but their cheers faded as they looked back up at the empty maintenance hatch. The celebration felt hollow, disconnected from the reality of what had just happened. They had not saved themselves. They had been saved by the ghost, the quiet woman they had ignored and the sergeant major had openly scorned. Their survival was a direct result of the very skills they had failed to recognize or value. In the aftermath of the chaos, a new, more profound silence settled over the hangar, a silence of awe and of shame. The comms unit on Davies's belt crackled, a burst of static that made every man jump. For a heart-stopping moment, they feared it was a new alarm. But then a voice came through, calm, authoritative, and impossibly clear. Acheron Command, this is Colonel Vance, CENTCOM. Do you read me? Davies fumbled for the handset, his mind reeling. Colonel Vance was the commander of the entire sector, a figure of near mythical status who had never, to anyone's knowledge, communicated directly with a forward operating base. Colonel Vance, this is Lieutenant Davies, acting commander of FOB Acheron. We rid you, sir. We have sustained heavy damage from a seismic event, but have just stabilized the primary power core. I am aware of the situation, Lieutenant, Vance's voice replied, a cold, precise instrument. I've been monitoring your internal comms chatter and sensor telemetry through a back channel. A rather inventive back channel, I might add. One that seems to have been activated just moments ago. Now, give me your report. Who, exactly, stabilized that core? Davies hesitated for only a second. Or he looked over at Kendrick, who seemed to have shrunk, his bulk no longer imposing, but merely sad. It was Corporal Eva Rostova, sir, Davies said, his voice firm. She navigated a structurally compromised sector after our conventional attempts to breach failed. Her actions, and hers alone, prevented a total loss of this facility. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Vance spoke again, his voice had lost its clinical detachment and was now laced with a cold, controlled fury. "Sergeant Major Kendrick, are you there?" Kendrick started, as if waking from a dream. He numbly took the handset from Davies. "Sir, Kendrick here, sir." "Sergeant Major," Vance began, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that was somehow more intimidating than a shout. "I have the logs from your last PT evaluation briefing. I have the transcripts of this morning's formation. I have a report here that cites your reckless and ill-conceived use of demolitions as the direct cause for the blockage that nearly doomed this multi-billion-dollar facility. You had the single most valuable asset in this entire command under your authority, and you used your position to mock and humiliate her. You valued your ego over the operational readiness of your post. You placed your faith in brute force and outdated protocols, and in doing so, you not only failed catastrophically, but you nearly got every soul on that base killed. Sergeant Major, you are hereby relieved of your duties and command. You are confined to your quarters under guard. A tribunal will be convened to determine the full extent of your incompetence. Is that understood?" "Sir, yes, sir," Kendrick stammered, his voice a broken thing. The handset slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. His reign was over. His world had been dismantled, not by an enemy, but by his own arrogance, and the final judgment had been delivered from half a world away. A new figure appeared at the edge of the hangar, walking out of the corridor from the now accessible maintenance levels. It was Rostova. She was covered in grease and concrete dust, but she moved with the same quiet, deliberate calm as always. She held a small, burnt-out servo motor in her hand. Vance's voice crackled over the comms again, his tone shifting back to one of professional respect. "Lieutenant, is Project Chimera with you?" Davies looked around in confusion. "Sir, I don't know who that is. There's no one by that designation on the base roster." Rostova stepped forward and took the radio from Davies. "Chimera is here, Colonel," she said into the handset, her voice flat and familiar. "The tertiary coolant pump's manual actuator was fused. I had to bypass it and hotwire the primary valve control. The base is stable, but a full structural survey is required. The damage to the load-bearing members in Sector Gamma is beyond local repair." A collective dawning understanding spread across the faces of the soldiers. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "Understood, Chimera," Vance's voice replied. "Good work. I'm retasking your mission profile. Your audit is complete. You are now in tactical command of Acheron until a relief commander can be flown in. See to the wounded and get me a full damage assessment." Rostova looked at the servo in her hand, then at the stunned faces around her. She was not a corporal. She was not a data analyst. She was Project Chimera. The name meant nothing to the grunts, but Davies, with his engineering background, felt a sudden chill. Project Chimera was a black-level spec ops initiative, a team of one. They were ghosts, red team specialists sent in under deep cover to audit the military's most critical infrastructure for weaknesses, both human and structural. They were legendary, spoken of in whispers. They didn't exist, but one of them was standing right in front of him. Her entire time at Acheron hadn't been a deployment. It had been an infiltration. Her skipping training had been her real mission, to walk the bones of the base, to learn its secrets, to find the very weaknesses that the earthquake had just exposed. The gauntlet, the object of Kendrick's obsession, was just another piece of data for her. She had analyzed it, solved it in her head, and dismissed it, just as she had dismissed him. She had just performed a feat that shattered the base record by an impossible margin, not as a display of ego, but as a simple, necessary act of transit. The revelation recontextualized everything. She wasn't an outsider who had proven herself. She was the ultimate insider who had been there all along, watching, judging, and waiting. In the days that followed, a new order settled over FOB Acheron. The noise was gone. Kendrick was gone, flown out on a priority transport to face his tribunal, a ghost in his own right, but one born of failure, not competence. The base operated with a quiet, focused efficiency under Rostova's temporary command. Her orders were sparse, logical, and delivered without emotion. She coordinated damage control, rerouted power, and prioritized repairs with the same dispassionate precision she had used to navigate the ruined hangar. The soldiers, once wary of her, now treated her with a mixture of reverent awe and a healthy dose of fear. They followed her commands without question, their obedience absolute. They had seen the truth of her, and the memory of her traverse across the ceiling was burned into their collective consciousness. They no longer saw a strange data analyst. They saw a force of nature. Lieutenant Davies, now her de facto executive officer, approached her on the third day. She was in the main control room, her attention focused on a holographic schematic of the base's damaged foundations. He held out a steaming mug. "Coffee, ma'am," he said, the ma'am feeling both strange and entirely appropriate on his lips. She took it without looking up, her eyes still tracing the glowing lines of the hologram. He lingered, not wanting to disturb her, but needing to understand. He cleared his throat. "That first move you made," he began, his voice low, "on the collapsed wall. You used a friction climb on a 40-degree slab of sheer duracrete. Standard doctrine says that's impossible without specialized gear. The surface coefficient is too low." Rostova paused her work. She turned her head, her gray eyes fixing on him. She considered his question, not as small talk, but as a genuine request for information. "Doctrine is based on averages," she said, her voice even. "Average body type, average strength-to-weight ratio, average nerve response. It assumes a static application of force. I wasn't static. I used a controlled dynamic friction model, applying pressure in brief, targeted pulses synchronized with my center of gravity's ascent vector. Doctrine is a guideline for the masses. It is not a law of physics." She turned back to her work, the conversation for her concluded. Davies stood there for a long moment, the simple technical explanation resonating more profoundly than any praise or commendation could have. He hadn't come to thank her. He had come to learn. It was the ultimate gesture of respect. He finally understood that she operated on a different level, in a world governed by a more fundamental set of rules than the ones in their field manuals. He nodded to himself and walked away, leaving her to her work. A week after the quake, a heavy transport shuttle descended into the repaired hangar bay. Her replacement, a grim-faced major with eyes that understood the true nature of Acheron's near demise, had arrived. Rostova's work was done. She met the new commander, handed him a datapad containing her complete, exhaustive assessment of the facility's every flaw, and walked toward the shuttle's ramp without a backward glance. She wore no medals, received no formal ceremony. Her victory was not in the accolades, but in the continued quiet hum of the bass around her. She had arrived as a whisper, and she left as one, her passage marked only by the absence she left behind. The official record for the gauntlet was never updated. It still bore the name of a long-forgotten Marine, a monument to a lesser form of strength. But the soldiers of FOB Acheron knew the truth. They would tell the story for years to come, the tale of the quiet analyst who ran on shattered steel in the dark. The legend of Eva Rostova, the ghost of the wire, became a part of the base's architecture, a permanent reminder that the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal is a quiet mind that sees the world not as it is, but as a system of problems waiting for a more elegant solution. Her legacy was not a name on a plaque, but a newfound respect for the quiet ones, for the analysts and technicians in the dark rooms, and a deep, abiding understanding that the loudest voice in the room is never the one you should be listening for.